Neighborhoods for the LGBTQ. How did we get here and how is it going? Welcome everyone to Powered by Rainbows. I'm of course your host, Professor Pride, and on today's show, we're talking about Gayborhoods. We'll first go over what a Gayborhood is, then we'll go over the history of where and why they started. Then we'll talk about how they evolved over the years, and finally we'll discuss the positive and the negative effects of them being a thing of the past. But before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Anyway, on to the show. Back where I grew up in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, we would drive through town and always see a collection of rainbow flags outside of the homes on Nicholas Street. But if you looked elsewhere in town, there were no rainbow flags to be found. And as a young child, knowing I was gay, which you can learn all about in this episode right here, I knew what rainbow flags meant. But I wondered why there were so many bunched up in one area. So I started asking around, and most people in the area called Nicholas Street the area's Gayborhood, since so many LGBTQ people lived on that street. And from there, I began to wonder why so many people lived in one certain area, specifically on one street, just because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. But as it turns out, this was happening not only across the country, but around the world. It was happening in big cities like Greenwich Village in New York City, Philadelphia, Davie Village in Vancouver, Potts Point in Sydney, Australia, Copenhagen, Soho in London, Sitges in Spain, and plenty more. But our small town of 13,000 people wasn't a big city, and it wasn't the only small town in the world to have a Gayborhood. So the big cities were far from the only ones to have this happen. In fact, this is such a normal thing that happens that it even has its own name. It's something called Gaytrification, which is the process by which a neighborhood becomes a hub of sorts for the LGBTQ community. Now, I hear you asking the questions, when did this become a thing and why? Well, the earliest known record of Gaytrification is something you can read about in a great book called A Queer History of America by Michael Bronsky. When the British settlers came to America, they forcefully did away with many LGBTQ-friendly and progressive values the Native Americans held up until that point. This is something we'll talk about in a future episode. At the time, the straight and cisgender settlers believed heavily in Puritan values and were trying their best to stomp out homosexuality and queerness from even their own fellow settlers and culture in the New World. So as Bronsky reports, quote, in 1624, a man by the name of Thomas Morton and others, including 30 male indentured servants, founded a decidedly non-Puritan colony in Wollaston, which is now the township of Quincy, outside of Boston, Massachusetts. They named the colony Marymount. And this is the first known record of a Gayborhood anywhere in the world. While little is known about how big these Gayborhoods were around Boston and how well they survived over the coming years as America became its own country, what is known is the history of how Gayborhoods exploded all over the world. To answer this, historians point to the year 1945, when the Second World War was ending. At that time, you were kicked out of the military of many countries just because you were perceived as homosexual or lesbian, and those who were kicked out were given a less than honorable discharge, meaning everyone basically knew exactly why you were kicked out. But still, the world was amidst a great war, and generals knew they needed soldiers, so some gay people were left in the military. But after the World War was over in 1945, the generals didn't care anymore about having countless soldiers, so they sent homosexuals home with the same less than honorable discharge from the military. And from what it seems, they were hoping when they got back home, the gay veterans would be locked up in prison or never given a proper job next to straight people because the military showcased their homosexuality by tainting them with this less than honorable discharge. And you might think this is a harsh criticism of the military of many countries back then, but remember, after World War II ended, the Allied forces, including America, United Kingdom, and more, all liberated the Nazi concentration camps and released most, but not all of the prisoners of war. The Allied forces chose to keep the gay prisoners in those concentration camps until the early 1970s, more than 25 years after the war ended. But getting back to our topic, when these gay people arrived back on their home soil, they were now outed as homosexual to everyone, and they knew if they went home, their families might not accept them. And for many people, even if their families would accept them, it would be dangerous for their families to showcase their acceptance in their hometowns. So the LGBTQ people decided to live on their own and stay in major port cities. These cities were the main places where the military ships and planes dropped them off in once they were discharged. And because of the laws in many countries at the time, these LGBTQ people flocked to the more affordable and run-down sections of the cities. Nowadays, if you look at the gayborhoods in many cities, you would hardly notice that it used to be in the ghettos of the city back when the gayborhoods were founded. But these areas were the only places the LGBTQ people could afford. After all, as we mentioned a moment ago, the military tainted these individuals with the stain of being LGBTQ back then, so it was hard to find a good-paying job. In these gayborhoods, LGBTQ people began living with one another, so at the very least, they could talk openly about being LGBTQ in their own homes. Gay people could have their partners over to visit, and their roommates weren't going to call the police. Trans individuals could wear the appropriate clothing and makeup inside of their own home, without their roommates speaking out against it. And from this mass migration, LGBTQ people and more founded small businesses where they could be careful but still, at least to a point, out of the closet in their neighborhood. But remember, these ghettos sometimes already had small businesses located inside of them before LGBTQ people migrated there. Some of these places included New York City's Stonewall Inn, which was a restaurant before the mafia purchased the restaurant and turned it into a gay nightclub in 1967, ahead of the 1969 famous riots. Similarly, the Compton Cafeteria in San Francisco, California, was opened in 1954 and then found itself in the middle of a gayborhood migration ahead of the 1966 Compton Cafeteria riots. The point is, as soldiers were being discharged and going home from the war, the LGBTQ individuals migrated to these same areas where they felt more comfortable being their true and authentic selves. Sure, the police still raided these areas, and it wasn't perfectly safe by any means, but it was safer than going home to their families, and safer than being outed back home, which is why some LGBTQ people never got to see their hometowns or their families ever again. And just take a second to remember, these were all soldiers who fought and risked dying to protect their countries, and yet this is how their countries thank them for their service. Now, as you might be quick to notice, these same cities or neighborhoods aren't as populated by LGBTQ members nowadays. Just taking a look at the old gayborhood near you, or the one near where I used to live, you'll notice the street isn't nearly as overrun with rainbow flags anymore. And sure, some of these neighborhoods might just have LGBTQ people who don't feel the need to put their rainbow flag outside that day. But hard data proves LGBTQ people have now moved. Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of British Columbia, Amin Ghaziani, did extensive research on this specific topic, and even wrote an entire book on it, which again, I encourage you to read if you're interested in this topic, or learning about gay history and culture. But he studied census data, and according to his research, between 2000 and 2010, the number of same-sex couples living in a traditional gayborhood declined, often as larger trends in urban life made those neighborhoods newly desirable destinations. In other words, the LGBTQ have now moved into the suburbs and towns across the country, and straight people have now moved into the old gayborhoods. In fact, census data proves that same-sex romantic couples are now living together in 93% of American counties. And as Vox points out, quote, the gay population is becoming less concentrated, as its legal, political, and social reality is increasingly accepted. While some gayborhoods are clearly struggling to keep their LGBTQ bars, restaurants, and stores open, with the influx of non-LGBTQ people moving to the areas, other cities are still thriving in the LGBTQ culture. To see examples of this, you need not look further than cities like New Hope, Pennsylvania, where literally every store still has rainbow flags outside. There is a clear, welcoming presence to the city for LGBTQ people. An overwhelming majority of the residents are LGBTQ, and they even have an annual Pride Festival. And cities like New Hope have some of the best economies in the country. A moment ago, we mentioned my old hometown of Pottsville, PA, where the Nicholas Street Gayborhood is located. They have a population of more than 13,000, but yet many storefronts are closed, and in certain areas the city can look abandoned. Just a few miles down the road in New Hope, Pennsylvania, they have just 2,500 residents, but yet every storefront is filled, and the city brings in more tourists than almost any neighboring city. But while Gayborhoods are clearly not going away tomorrow, some of them around the world already have gone away at least partially. In some cities like London, LGBTQ businesses are facing permanent closure, thanks to the community moving back to other towns and cities elsewhere in the country. And as we pointed out, this is because the community is becoming more accepted in mainstream society, which is almost universally being looked at as a great thing for our community, and something which was long overdue for us. But this leaves some hidden consequences behind. In many countries around the world, including here in the United States, as LGBTQ people moved out of Gayborhoods, the towns and cities they moved into have since become way more LGBTQ friendly. This is something called representation. If non-LGBTQ people see people from other sexual orientations or gender identities, they start realizing their similarities and how normal they are in comparison, so they begin accepting their neighbors more. This is the exact reason why we push for LGBTQ representation in our TV shows, movies, and music. But the LGBTQ community also pushes for representation in our governments around the world too, with the hopes that these people will introduce LGBTQ-friendly legislation to protect us. And in these old Gayborhoods with 99% LGBTQ populations, it was quite easy to have these areas elect LGBTQ-friendly candidates to represent their areas and values. Nowadays, the percentage of LGBTQ people compared to non-LGBTQ is roughly still the same, at around 10% of the world's population. But now that LGBTQ people moved out of these Gayborhoods, they account for a smaller percentage of the voters in their current hometowns. This, combined with the fact that 1 in 5 LGBTQ people did not vote in recent years, doesn't help the LGBTQ cause. And for this reason, it's become harder for our community to elect our own members or our allies to office. With this said, in the recent years, LGBTQ people have made history being elected more and more often to higher positions in government, with candidates like Pete Buttigieg in 2020 being the first openly gay presidential candidate. But these accomplishments owe much thanks to the normalization, equality legislation, and representation our community has fought for and received in the past 50 years. In my humble opinion, I believe Gayborhoods are still needed, and I frequently travel from my new hometown to New Hope, Pennsylvania, just to be a part of such a genuinely kind and accepting culture. But as we continue with our work of fighting for equality, the question remains that if we get what we are fighting for and homophobia ends, will Gayborhoods be able to survive? And that, my friends, is something that only time and your continued support of the culture will be able to tell. Anyway, that's all for our episode today. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you like our content and want to support more LGBTQ education in the future, please consider checking out our merchandise store or becoming a member. Don't forget to like this video, comment down below your LGBTQ-friendly thoughts, hit that rainbow subscribe button so you don't miss out on new episodes of the show, and share this video with others. I'm your host, Matt Haslam. This has been PBR. Have a gay day, everyone, and bye for now. Still not enough rainbows? Click here to see more weekly episodes of Powered by Rainbows, Semester 4, only on MHP TV.